Welcome to the Industry of UX, Episode 3. Paul Pittman and I put together a series for folks that are interested in moving into the UX world, for new UX designers, and veterans that are interested in a new perspective. In this episode, we're going to cover getting ready for the job market in the industry of UX. So, portfolio, resume, and a couple of tips and tricks we picked up along the way. In the next episodes, we're also going to cover the skill set and mindset needed to be prepared for a UX interview, whiteboard challenges, how to articulate design decisions, what your first UX job could look like, and so much more. You can subscribe to the Industry of UX on your favorite podcast app, and you can also visit our website at theindustryofux.com and send feedback to hello@theindustryofux.com. Thank you so much for listening. And now, let's dive right into the episode with a question. What is the difference between UX and UI design?
Good question. So I always kind of separate the two. When we're looking at a UX and UI, basically kind of what we're saying, that visual representation. The UX side I find is more focused on the problem solving. How do we get to an end-to-end experience, figuring out what use cases and corner cases that we're going to run into along the way when we build out an application. And then all those conversations that are happening with stakeholders and research and customers and all those types of things. Then when I look at UI, that to me is the visual side of things. Now we're factoring branding, messaging, color contrast, and obviously accessibility. So for me, visual design has a role to play in this. You can combine the two to get an end-to-end experience when you're trying to actually design something from a UX perspective. So when I look at visual design on that level, I do have that separation that I put into a day-to-day. That also helps me understand too that when I'm building something, I'm focused on what I'm supposed to be focusing on and not being sort of confused or bombarded with other things that could bring in the glossy side of things. And what I mean by glossy is that sort of fit, finish, polish at the end of the line that you really want to do now because it's the more gratifying sort of cool thing to show. So when I look at it, that's how I separate visual design versus UX.
That's a good way to put it. Follow-up question for you.
Mm-hmm.
How much do they overlap though?
And that's the thing. And I would say more often than not, because it's the thing that you do have in the back of your mind, but that's not the thing that you're working on at that moment. So what I mean by that is that even though you're thinking about the problem, there's that level of UI, like accessibility, for example, which deals a lot with not just color contrast and images, but other things in play like voice and tracking and that kind of thing. So to me, it's an overlap, but it's also a thing that sits in the back of my mind that doesn't really go away. It's just always constant. But for me specifically, I still try and draw that line, or else I will get a blurred experience if I try and think about the polish while thinking about the problem. So it's like
Right.
a PP. So that to me is a good question. And I think for everyone who gets into this industry, they're going to find a way to go about that in their own way. I don't think it's a recipe or one all solution. I think it's just going to be a way of how they do it and figure out the best approach for them. For me, that's mine.
Yeah, I have pretty much the same opinion. And UI and UX, they have the best partnership in a design system because you do have the principles behind it, but then you also have to have a way to execute that design system. And that's when you have the UI side of things. And then you do have developers coming in and also working, executing on the development side of things. And branding too, right? Because design system is not just a set of components that developers can just drag and drop. Well, it's not that easy, but let's just say
if it were
for the
that
sake
easy.
of time. Exactly. Drag and drop on the page. But there is also a side of a design system where you have the branding, the colors, and there is a lot of accessibility that goes behind it, the do's and don'ts, and then the voice, as you mentioned. And this is definitely a focus that we want to bring in a later episode, maybe when we have established what the culture of UX is and then blending that into a design system would be great. But
Mhm.
getting back to what we want to talk about today, which is getting ready for the job market inside of the industry of UX. So with the difference between UX and UI kind of established, I actually wanted to ask you about the portfolio of a UX designer. UX is about solving problems. How do you show that?
Yeah, that's a thing that not only how do you show it, but how do you feel confident in the ability to show it? That's the other question. So for me, when I think about how to build a portfolio, I do take a step back and I don't think so much on who's going to look at it. That is a factor, but I would always think, how would I want to be displayed? If someone was going to display something to me, what would I be expecting? And that's when I start thinking in my head about my portfolio. What do I need to have in there? Now, because when it comes to UX in the portfolio, you really want to put down your thought process, right? What it took for you to make these decisions. How do you come up with these decisions? How do you back up these decisions? Where's the data? All these other types of things. So when I look at a portfolio, it's nice to present that end product, which looks great and rich and fun to use and all those types of things. But to me, in a portfolio, there needs to be that back end thinking that has to be apparent to me before I get to that glossy. Because what, from my thinking, is that if I'm only see the glossy, I'll have more questions about what it took to get here, right? Then those questions could go away more or less if I saw that already in the beginning. And then when it comes to the glossy, it's sort of that nice, this looks really good. I see how you did it. This is the finish line product that looks wonderful. But being presented with an end product first would leave me just making a list of questions to ask that could have been surfaced earlier in the portfolio by presenting the thinking. And when I look at a portfolio for a UX designer, that's what goes through my head. And I think industry has come around to that, because I know in these early stages of UX that everybody always kind of wanted to see the end product of what did you create, how good of a designer were you, those types of things. But as we get more savvy and companies become more wiser with understanding what it requires to be a UX person, they are thinking on that level now of what the effort was and how did you communicate this effort and what are the efficiencies and deficiencies of approaching your problem. Because that to me is time spent, right? And for an organization, they want to see that if they're going to invest in you and they're looking at your portfolio, how much effort are they investing in you to get to this product? If they see gaps where there's not the ability to communicate with stakeholders or so on, or they see that you didn't do any good studies or research, or you didn't do any sketching to ideate quickly, they'll see that more now than they ever did before, and they'll see the level of investment that they're making. Whereas if that's present at the very beginning and it's clear, then that level of investment kind of shrinks within the organization and makes you more attractive to the employer. That's my thinking.
Absolutely. And to add on top of that, just a different perspective. If I were the hiring manager of a company and I were looking for a UX designer, if I only saw the end product, I will even ask if this person is a UX designer, meaning I'm just seeing it the solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if UX is problem solving, and I think that it is problem solving, where is the problem? What problem were you solving with this? How did you know that it was a problem?
Mm-hmm.
What type of research did you do? Did you talk to the customers? How do you know that those are the customers? What type of process led you eventually to this specific solution? Show me the customer centric, show me the user centric process. If I'm hiring a UX designer, I'm interested in, as you mentioned, in learning everything that went behind that. Because if I hire you with that position, I am not going to care as much about the UI side of it, but I want to see the value that you're bringing as a problem solver. So key point here is for those out there that are looking to getting in the job market as a UX designer, you need to showcase your thinking process. Show me your case studies, show me your post-it notes and your whiteboards and your wireframes.
Totally agree. I mean, being a visual person as well, I think of it as like, when you buy that vehicle and it looks great on the shell and it looks like it's a powerful car and you're gonna have so much fun, and you get in it and it's just clunky and sluggish and just, it drives like a Flintstone car. And you don't get that when you see it from the visual side, but once you start giving it a spin, you realize, oh man, what did we miss? That becomes a problem. And that's why I try, when I look at my portfolio, visual overlays, but that's not the solution. The solution is everything else that goes on behind it, and that's all the mechanics. And having that in your portfolio clear stated is of a huge advantage to anybody getting in the industry.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I feel that if I'm looking at your portfolio and it looks terrible when I look at it from my phone compared to when I'm looking at it from my desktop, if you're sending me the link to that portfolio that looks great on one but terrible on the other, I start questioning your choices as a UX designer. Meaning, that I could be looking at your portfolio from anywhere. So even the format of your portfolio does matter, because it's not just the design and thinking process behind your solutions, but also the format that you present your portfolio in is actually important, because it adds on to your credibility as a UX practitioner, as a UX expert, depending on the position you're applying for. So what are your thoughts on this one, Paul?
No, I agree. I mean, that's a different, to me, it's a differentiator, right? So you're thinking about the entire thing. So when you're looking at presenting your portfolio, that's one of the things that helps you separate yourself from everyone else. It's that idea that you follow through the entire thing, rather than just building a website that clicks to a bunch of images that just displays your work. It's to separate yourself. You'd want to go from, entire experience of presentation. So to me, that is one of the things that gets missed a lot in this industry, is a website, or not even a website. It doesn't even have to be a website. For me, I'll give you a personal experience that I never went the website route to display my work. I went with an interactive PDF that I could post on a website that people can have access to, that gave me a whole lot of functionality that turned my portfolio into a major gallery experience, as opposed to going through a website. What that did was it showed to the audience that I was using a different medium to help me maintain things that are easier for me to update and iterate on and then publish quickly. I mean, a web could be that as well, but I was leveraging Adobe at that point, I think, and Illustrator back in the day, to get to that state, because I felt like every website that I was seeing was very generic and I wanted to do something different. So I created a series of PDFs, uploaded it to this really cool website that added this really interesting feature that allowed you to flip pages, zoom in, zoom out, click on context, have some interaction. That to me, I thought was really engaging, and it seemed to have worked in over these years. But I haven't updated my portfolio now for such a long time. So when I started getting into that industry, thinking about how to separate myself from competition, that was one of my approaches.
All right. So I used to bring my portfolio to interviews. And when I'm saying I used to bring my portfolio to interviews,
A printed version?
I will print each and every logo or interface or whatever it was that I was presenting, and put it in a little booklet and bring it with me. Forget the computer, because at the time, Wi-Fi wasn't reliable and we didn't have guest Wi-Fis or anything like that, especially in Italy. DSL in 2010 was hot in Italy. Here we had faster speeds, but in Italy it was hot then. And so you couldn't really rely on bringing your computer, because you could show, maybe if you downloaded the website that you made and used it offline, maybe it could work, but you couldn't really rely on that. So I printed stuff out in high quality, right? And then show it to the client or to the, to the hiring manager or the recruiter. So it was an experience back then. So I actually have a question. How can a new designer, or how can a designer that is approaching the UX industry for the first time, or has been in the UX industry for a little bit, how can they differentiate themselves from all other designers and all other UX practitioners that are at the same level that they are at?
To me, that's another awesome question, and I'm sure a lot of people have thought about this one because the market is picking up and stuff, and they want to know, how do I do that? Now, I can tell you one of the things that I always found interesting is that if you're starting out for the very first time, you don't have a lot of experience, but you have other jobs that you've worked on or even a career before UX, I would think that's a good platform to start jumping off of, meaning that, let's say from my personal example, I always try to relate to my own real life examples. But when I got into industry of UX, I came originally from architecture. So I leaned heavily on what I did for architecture as part of where I can start in my career, working for a company maybe in the architectural industry, maybe in the consulting industry. And when you work in architecture, there's about 6 different consultants. There's electrical, mechanical, structural, landscape, and obviously architectural. And you look at those things, you say to yourself, okay, how can I then embed myself in that industry with this new UX knowledge, and vice versa. So when I started getting in the industry, I looked at that first, trying to make myself unique by talking on those things that maybe not apply to the company that I'm working for, or apply to the company that I used to work for or has a relationship with, but then present it my UX designer career as a possible slot within that company. Now it's tricky because one, you'd like to see them have a posting. So let's say an architectural firm had a posting for a designer, a UX designer, or a web developer. Even in a web development position, you could go in there and say, I come from this industry, I know this industry, and I can apply this really, this UX skill that I have. The other way to go about it is to say there's a company out there, maybe it's a gaming company, and they're looking for a UX designer. You can lean on your strengths of what you did in your previous roles to help surface design solutions or just problem thinking. And try and see if you can kind of differentiate yourself, slot yourself in there differently, and have a unique conversation as opposed to just having another UX conversation. So when that question happens, that's usually my go-to answer. If none of those apply and you're straight out of high school and then you're straight into college, obviously know your strengths and maybe perhaps look at what you think you can do. And internships are there in the industry. They're there for a reason, meaning that just because it's an internship or it's a lower level position, that you are going to be competing with somebody who's in a more senior spot. I think companies create those positions because they know in advance what they need. Either even at that time, or what they're going to need in the future. So they're saying, okay, we need a intern to get up to speed with where we're at in our systems. Our budgets say we can support this because we don't really need a full-fledged designer now, but we will in the next couple of months. So let's bring in an internship and turn this person into a designer. So even if that's the case for you, understand that the companies are thinking that way, and taking an internship would be a benefit to you and to the company. So applying for those roles, if you get to have a conversation, have that kind of conversation of, hey, it's great that you had this internship. I'm looking forward to taking part of this. What are the future plans of transitioning out from internship into a permanent role? Have you considered this? Have you considered that? That to me is a really good way to get into the industry as well when you're starting out.
I actually started my career in design and then merged into UX, but I did start with an internship, lasted for 3 months, and then they saw the value of keeping me on and I got hired full time. So there is definitely that opportunity. It could also give you an opportunity to test the waters, see if you like the career, right? If you like UX. But something else that I wanted to mention that you brought up, there is such a thing as specific knowledge. Specific knowledge is really combining things that only you, or likely only you, know, and leveraging these things. So what you mentioned before, for instance, if you have, so I used to be a professional musician, for instance, right? I did it for a few years. So I have that knowledge. I have that skill set. Now, if I combine that with UX, and I apply for specific jobs that are in the UX industry, but also in the audio music industry, now I'm going to be a prime candidate for that
Mm-hmm.
because I'm combining skill sets. So
Yep.
combining the skill sets is what is going to make you stand out. So look into your hobbies, the knowledge that you have acquired
Mm-hmm.
in the decades that you have been alive, assuming that you are 20 or older. But if you are younger than that, the things that you have picked up that are unique to you, your passions, your hobbies, how can you leverage that and actually showcase that and apply it to jobs that do leverage that do want that?
Mm-hmm.
That's going to make you stand out from the generalist that does have that, doesn't showcase it, and only does show an average or a generic knowledge of UX.
That's a great example. That's great. That's a great example. Because I can even tell you, like, you have to be a little bit odd in UX when you're a designer, right? Like you have to be a little bit like in Amazon land, they call it peculiar, but you definitely have to be a little bit off. Like you need something there as a designer. So yeah, I actually totally think that's a really good point you made there. Very true.
And I think that could carry over to your resume too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because your resume, there are such things as resume best practices, especially when it comes to UX. You have to tailor your resume for the UX industry and the industry that you are trying to get your UX job into. So, Paul, question for you. Couple of best practices about structuring a resume specifically for UX.
Yeah. So to me, there's a bunch of things that I think about, right? And when I say what I think about, it's not so much how I think about how to design my resume so much, but more about how it's going to be used. So today's technologies, a lot of companies are becoming really savvy when it comes to receiving resumes. So having strong content and words in the right place, treat it like a website, right? Like how would Google search your website? Think about how Google would search your resume, because machine learning is going that direction. So when you submit resumes, a lot of things are happening within the robots. They're pulling data, making sense of the data, making algorithms and applying that data, and in some cases grading the resume, right? So that's number one for me. Second is think about the audience that's going to read it and speak that language, right? So if you're looking for media, if you're looking for web, if you're looking for anything else like in sales or stuff like that, make sure that content is specific to that audience. And I always find when you start to use acronyms in resumes, it hurts that robot search that I was just mentioning earlier, but then it also shows that you expect the audience who's going to be looking at this to understand that. You can't expect that, right? So one of the things as a designer, is UX designer, is that we try and remove assumption from everything as much as possible. So when you look at designing your resume, think about that level as well. And then I guess one more for me would be if it does get printed. In most cases, it pretty much doesn't. Someone has a digital copy somewhere. They're using a tablet or something to look at it. I would sway away from a lot of ink-heavy resumes. Like I've seen a lot of resumes where the column on the left is solid, and then we got this heavy border around the edges and stuff and things like that. And you're expecting them to waste, a fair bit of ink on this to print it, just for the sake of doing it. Maybe, then what happens to it afterwards, right? And then also, if you're doing edges, if you're doing a blue edge to the entire edge of your resume, are we really expecting printers to do edge printing? If they're printing it in the office, I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10, they're not, right? So you're going to lose that, and whatever design that you put on that is going to get lost. And then just organize your content, make sure it's clear and easy to understand, give it the right breathing space, the white padding and white space that you need, so that it's easy to read. And I guess last but not least, put a good font. Choose a good font.
One. Choose
Yeah,
one.
that's right. One. Absolutely. Don't choose 6 or 7. Choose one good font and stick to that font. And that's it. I mean, it's a resume, right? It's hard to get past that paper trail. That's the hardest thing to get past when it comes to getting that interview, is getting past that paper trail. But you're not the only one suffering from that. companies are suffering from that as well. And the easier you make it for them and whatever systems they have to make it easier for themselves, work your resume to work with those systems. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Best practices for me, as always, in my case specifically, my resume, as I said, is black and white. It's 2 columns, one with the experience and the other one with the skill set. And then I add some of that specific knowledge that I mentioned before. I do mention that, I don't know, I used to be a professional musician, right? I do mention that I am a Highland Games athlete. These things are little and are little aspects of your resume, but they do speak to the person that you are, because they're not hiring a robot that does UX. They're hiring a complete person. So they want to know you as a person. So that communication, that put the human factor into what you create as someone that wants to be hired.
Absolutely. I mean, what you're saying comes down to culture, right? Because they're looking at a culture fit. They won't get it 100% on the resume, but at least there's going to be something there that triggers, hey, this could be a potential cultural fit. Because we hear that a lot in the industry, right? It's like, is it a good cultural fit? Could have the greatest skills. I mean, I remember Tony at Zappos was saying we could have the best coders, but if we don't feel they could fit our culture, well, we won't hire them. And so that's got a lot to do with those little intricacies that you're talking about by putting those in the resume. And, you know, the other thing too is I don't think, actually, that's not that I don't think, but I don't believe it has to be a one pager. I believe you can go into 2 or 3 pages. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you need to get a lot of information out there so that they get a good, strong understanding, I wouldn't probably go much further than 3 because I would keep it to the most current stuff, right? And anything longer than that, you're probably surfacing things that are probably 20 years ago, most likely. But if you have, 5 years of experience that you can really elaborate over 2 or 3 pages, there's nothing wrong with going that route. I don't think you have to stick to a one pager.
When folks approach the UX industry, and this is true for a lot of different industries, but when they do approach an industry to be hired in, what is the role of social media in hiring? How are hiring managers looking at it, and how should you, as a potential new hire, approach your social media profiles?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting one because we don't know. I can't speak for a lot of organizations, but for me, I don't have a Facebook page. I don't have a Twitter account, and I don't have Instagram. And I'm not saying I don't have them because they're bad things. I just feel like I don't have the time to do these things. But if you do them, I'm assuming that some organizations would be looking at that, not because they're trying to essentially just size you up, but maybe there has to be some relationship to the actual job that requires that there maybe be some social media associated to the actual job responsibilities. For me, the one that's always worked out for me, and I'm not taking any sponsorship or any funding for this, but LinkedIn has always been my source of truth. There's been a lot of things that I put within social media on LinkedIn that are really about career development and things that I see that happening in the world, real-time events. So when it comes to hiring managers and resumes, I think that's the number one source that's out there nowadays that people go to find information about you. And I think it's a great resource, to be honest with you. I don't think there's anything bad there. I think there's some things you want to be cautious too. I know a lot of people have a lot of opinions and voices and things that they believe in that you might not believe in. So when it comes to my social media profile, I don't talk about those certain topics. So I leave politics out of my social media, which is on LinkedIn. I don't talk about race or religion or anything along those lines because I don't think that's the platform for it. I think it's really a platform for you to showcase skills and have conversations with those who might be interested in connecting with you as a professional. So to me, when I look at social media, looking at getting hired and looking at hiring, LinkedIn for me is really one of the biggest platforms. But thinking about the rest of them, I wouldn't oust them as much because they might be applicable to what you might be interested in doing with UX, like as the role. Like if you're in the e-commerce business and we do a lot of stuff with Instagram that sells products and stuff like that, there might need to be something there that they would like to see that you have some maybe Instagram experience because you're part of the Instagram social network. To me, that's where I'm at. I don't think it plays a huge role in anybody making a decision in hiring you. I think it's just a way for them to get more information.
That's a good call. I think that, so if you're posting very polarized topics or very controversial statements and you fight on social media, unless you're applying for something that allows for that and actually encourages that, maybe some news outlets or I don't know. I'm sure there's someone out there that is fine with that, but I will stay away from that. Stay professional, at least in the social media that you share publicly. Now, private social media, so if your account can be seen only by friends, like something where you have to approve who looks at your profile, now that's different. But if you have a public profile, keep it clean. That's my best recommendation. All right, so we do have one last topic, which is talking about the terms to get familiar with when you're approaching the industry of UX. However, we are kind of running out of time, and I think that this could be almost a topic and an episode in and of itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a little deck that you can download from theindustryofux.com, and we are just going to deliver that to you that way. So you can download it, look over it, and buff up your knowledge of UX terminology. And of course, as always, comments and feedback is welcome. So let us know how you like that downloadable file. And I think, Paul, that for today, we are kind of wrapping it up here. Do you have any last thoughts or comments?
No, nothing for me. I think this was fun. I love talking about this stuff like ongoing. So I think this is a good episode. Looking forward to the next one.
And that's the end of my chat with Paul. Thank you so much for listening. You can show support for this podcast by subscribing to The Industry of UX on your favorite podcast app. And you can visit theindustryofux.com and send us feedback to hello@theindustryofux.com. Once again, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.